Good evening to everybody who's already signed in. It's now 6:55. We're going to get started promptly at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. So hang in there. We'll get started in about 5 more minutes. Until then, though, if you'd like to go to the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a button labeled View. You can watch this presentation in any view that you prefer, but if I could suggest, I would set your view to be speaker mode this evening, and we'll see you soon.
Good afternoon, Laura. Is it that time?
It is time to begin. And I also want to remind guests about our view real quick. If you want to go to the right-hand corner of your screen, I would suggest watching our presentation this evening in speaker view, and to make sure you turn your volume on your computer or your smart device, whichever form you're watching this on, its volume all the way up. We do our best.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Kowalski Salter, and I am the Executive Director of the 1st Division Museum, a suburb of Chicago. Wheaton, Illinois is our location, and tonight we are in for a treat. We are going to be hearing from the author who actually lived the story that he wrote in this book, Desert Redlegs, and it is the story about the artillerymen who served in Desert Storm and supported the Big Red One. They wore the Big Red One patch, and he'll talk more about that and, of course, this significant day in history. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to our next 2 Date with Histories and do some housekeeping. So I don't know if we have a slide on this, but our next Date with History is going to be on the 18th of March, and it is going to be The Storm on Our Shores by best-selling or Pulitzer Prize winning and best-selling author Mark Masick, and he's going to talk about the Battle of Attu, which was in World War II. And then about 2 weeks after that, we'll actually have our next Date with History, and we're going to be joined by Lieutenant General retired Roger Schultz, who is the president of the Army Historical Foundation, which is at the National Museum of the United States Army, and he's going to introduce us to that great institution. So please tune in to that. Some of you may know the museum actually opened about 3 or 4 months ago during the pandemic. It was set back a few months because of the pandemic, and hopefully the doors will open again. And this is the first National Museum of the United States Army. All of the services have one, and people may be saying, well, I've been to an Army museum at Fort Riley, or when I was in Korea, or when I was in Germany, or when I was at Fort Benning, but those are regional and those are subject matter museums. This is the first National Museum of the United States Army, and so we are in for a treat to have General Schultz share that with us as well. And then last but not least, I want to continue to introduce you to our first travel program called Footsteps of the First. And this is the first of many that we hope to do. And I'm not going to say hope, that we will do. This particular one, we will be going to Europe, mainly France, and it is going to cover the epic route and story and combat experiences of the Big Red One from D-Day, June 6th of 1944, to the Battle of the Bulge, which was mid-December 1944 to mid-January 1945. And one of our great colleagues, Jackie Gillespie, will be our expert leading that tour. So without any further ado, did I miss anything, Laura?
That was all of it. Well done.
Okay, great. So let me go on to the housekeeping, and Laura will keep me straight here. But, first of all, we're going to follow our normal format. The last 15 minutes will be left for Q&A. Please, when you do the Q&A, use the question and answer feature on your computer. Do not use the hand raising feature. And Laura will be looking at those questions throughout. Her and one of my other colleagues is on with us too, Galen Piper. Between the two of them, we're going to make sure we capture as many questions as possible and send those over to Colonel Lingamfelter. And knock on wood, We haven't had any serious technical difficulties since we've been doing this in the pandemic. So we don't expect to do that or have that tonight. So what I'm going to do now is transition to read my notes so I make sure I cover everything. So I'm going to transition to introducing our guest speaker for tonight. Our guest speaker for tonight is Colonel Retired L. Scott Lingamfelter, and he attended the Virginia Military Institute, where he earned a BA in history in 1973. After graduating from VMI, he was commissioned in the regular Army and began a career as a field artilleryman and a Middle East Foreign Area Officer. For those of you who know, a FAO. In 1981, he completed his MA in Comparative Governments of the Middle East and Soviet Foreign Policy from the University of Virginia. After many assignments in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, both in command and staff positions, he retired in 2001 to pursue a second career as a legislator in the Virginia General Assembly, and he served there for 16 years from 2002 to 2018. Colonel Lingamfelter accumulated significant experience in the war-torn Middle East as a military advisor with the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. He later served in the 1st Infantry Division during Operation Desert Storm as the executive officer of the Division Artillery that planned and executed the largest field artillery assault on enemy forces since World War II. So without any further ado, Scott, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is a really unique time in the history of our country. We are beset with this COVID piece, but there's an opportunity to be optimistic, and I think that part of that optimism resides in the fact that we can do these kinds of presentations on Zoom and that we bring a lot of people in so that they can participate. So I am looking forward to coming up to the museum. It is our museum. It's the Big Red One Museum. And so I think that all of us should make an effort to get there. I certainly want to, particularly since I gave them my battle map and I kind of want to see my battle map. So first, let me thank the museum again for asking me to make this presentation. I'm very honored to be included among those who have gone before me. I'm also very grateful to the Association of the U.S. Army, and in particular, Joe Craig, who is the chairman of their book program at AUSA. He has been very much a help to me and an encourager in getting this book, Desert Redleg, published by the University Press of Kentucky. I also want to take the opportunity to say up front, there are 3 people I want to mention up front. One of them is Lieutenant Colonel Dean Phillips, and I'm not sure that they're logged in tonight or not, but Dean was one of my first battery commanders, and that guy has the patience of Job. And I don't think I'd be here today if he hadn't been one of the key mentors in my young life. And also, he was one of the fellows who read behind me in this book. And as an artilleryman and a veteran of Vietnam, he was very helpful to me in proofing this book and getting it done. Also, Colonels Joe Monco and Dick Sherwood, both of them were very, very important to me early on in my career. Why am I saying that? Because it's really important to remember who got you there. It's really important to reach back and remind ourselves that we're not successful in and of ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of other people, and I think that's something we have to remember as individuals. We certainly have to remember that as veterans of the Big Red One. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit about my background. It was a good intro that you did. I'm fortunate to have had 2 interesting and engaging careers as a soldier and artilleryman and a Middle East specialist. My time as a delegate in the Virginia House of Delegates, every day I was a delegate, I was reminded how much I missed the Army. However, While being a writer is very rewarding, I have to say being a grandfather is even better. Next slide. A little bit about my primary sources. I kept a diary, and my boss, Lieutenant General retired Mike Dotson, also did as well. He provided his to me, and I was very glad they lined up rather nicely. I also had my original battle map, my 1st Infantry Division operational graphics, copies of operational orders, fire plans, and so forth, that were very, very important to me in establishing that timeline, an accurate timeline to validate events, places, and so forth. Most helpful of all were the after-action reviews that were developed by my subordinates, the HHB commander, Captain Merv Heimel, the B Battery 6th Field Artillery commander, Captain Rick Nichols, the Delta Battery 25th Target Acquisition Battery, Captain Larry Seafelt, and the 12th Chemical Company, Captain Phil Visser. All of them were very, very important AARs and very, very important to getting the timelines right. Next slide, please. So why this book? This is the first war, the first major conflict that we had after Vietnam. But it has received essentially footnote status in large measure because it unfolded so quickly. It was a decisive win and didn't have some of the controversies associated with what we have seen in previous conflicts. This morning, Tom Rain sent me an email, and he pointed out that, surprisingly, here, the 30th anniversary of our ground invasion into Iraq, and not a word of it was mentioned on national television. And that, to me, is a remarkable thing. But that only reinforces in my mind why it is so important to have events like this, to remind people, the current generation of soldiers, what this division did in the Gulf War and why it was so important. Second, this book, this was the right war for the right reason because it addressed unambiguous aggression. It was also a real test of the doctrine developed and to address a Soviet threat, but actually employed against Soviet-equipped surrogates in Iraq. Third, I wanted to document the role of the artillery in this war because nowhere else has that story been fully told. The role of the artillery has received scant treatment when in fact it was decisive during the 8 days of artillery raids and the firing of a huge artillery preparation that supported the breach operation of the division, the Big Red One, into the 26th Infantry Division, the Iraqi 26th Infantry Division. Next slide. Here are the central characters of the book. All were superb, and I have something to say about them at the end of this presentation. I have included their retired ranks here, but all of them, as you can see, were quite successful and deservedly so. Next slide, please. Here are the major events that the book addresses. As you can see, this was not a slow-moving timeline. It was actually 8 months of high tempo, packed with things that had to happen, and in fact, did happen. Next slide. To give you an orientation on our area of operations, this map reveals the battle space within which we operated in a very volatile area of the Middle East. I mean, you can see this as the upper northern area of the Persian Gulf. And recall that in that border area just to the north of the box is where the Iran-Iraq war raged for years. So this is a very volatile area. Next slide. This shows the vast movement that we would make from the port of Dammam, where we picked up our equipment, to positions in the desert where we would execute that huge left hook that General Norman Schwarzkopf devised to deceive and then destroy Iraqi forces by driving deep into Kuwait. Next slide. No presentation would be complete without reference to the mission that the organizations had. Here is both divisions and the Divardi's respective missions. Simply put, the Big Red One, 30 years ago to this day, in the top statement, was tasked to open a huge breach for the 7th Corps to attack through. And while the DIVARTY was given the mission of supporting that key objective as seen in the lower statement. That would take a huge effort, as I share in the book. Next slide. The next series of slides shows how the war played out according to the phases I used to tell the story. These are not the original phases that were in the operational plan of the division. They are simply phases that I have characterized in this book to break it down for the reader so you have a flavor for the stages we went through from beginning to end. Next slide. This shows our initial 465-kilometer movement from the port tactical assembly to the tactical assembly area Roosevelt in the desert. This location actually was designed, this initial location, TAA Roosevelt, was designed to deceive the enemy as to the direction that we would take in the attack. Next slide. This portrays our movement further to the west, 160 kilometers, which was our initial jump from TAA Roosevelt to our pre-attack positions opposite the Iraqi 26th Infantry Division, where we conducted our artillery raids. Next slide. We then moved forward into the breach area to conduct the attack on the 24th and the 25th of February, where we fired a huge preparation in support of the division's assault. Next slide. After the breach, the 1st Infantry Division then attacked another 115 kilometers deeper into Iraq to take on the Iraqi Republican Guards situated on Objective Norfolk. Next slide. We then attacked 80 kilometers into Kuwait to complete the liberation mission. This was extremely challenging desert terrain that we had to cover in the process. Next slide. We were then ordered to advance 35 kilometers north to clear Safwan airfield in Iraq. That airfield, by the way, was built by the Russians, so it was sort of ironic in a way that the US wound up occupying it in Iraq. And we found, when we got there, a remaining Iraqi tank brigade that we had to clear. Greg Fontenot, in his book, does a marvelous job of laying that out. You should get his book and read it. It was a fascinating showdown, but it was a problem we had to deal with right toward the end of our conflict time. And I also shared that event in my book from a DIVARTY perspective. Next slide, please. We then went back into Iraq, 150 kilometers, to occupy positions to await Saddam's capitulation or to be prepared to resume hostilities if necessary. Next. Finally, we made a 2-day, 150-kilometer movement. It was a happy one, by the way, back to Saudi Arabia. In sum, all of these movements from January to April of 1991 amounted to 1,195 kilometers. Quite a march, all of which I describe in the book. Next slide. I won't cover this in any detail now. I do in the book. But I want you to understand the tremendous contribution that was made by the artillery to support the Big Red One. And this slide shows it. The roll-up at the bottom says it all. Within the 5 brigade-sized artillery organizations, 2 from US forces in Europe, 2 from the US, and 1 from Great Britain, there were a total of 17 battalions of artillery supporting the 1st Infantry Division. This was a major decision by the 7th Corps to support the 1st Infantry Division's breach of Iraqi defensive positions. It was also an unprecedented assembly of artillery we have not seen since World War II in any operation. And Colonel Mike Dotson and his DIVARTY team had the mission to make all of this come together effectively. Next slide, please. Here are some pictures in the book of our units firing missions, including 155 millimeter howitzers, and the multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS. They were all quite busy. Next slide. I would draw your attention to some key points on this slide. The 8 days of raids were a combined arms operation with force protection provided to the Vardy and our units by our maneuver brigades. And those artillery units, duly protected, were able then to continue on to fire those raids on enemy targets. For Dotson, raids had several purposes. First, to destroy the enemy. Second, to test the enemy's response. Third, to practice counterfire on the enemy if any came about. And fourth, to train our units and headquarters in tactical movement and fire control while giving soldiers an opportunity to experience firing in a combat condition to test their mettle. Dotson gave each one of the headquarters shown earlier an opportunity to lead one of these raids so they could exercise their own command and control systems. So the point is, even in combat, you continue to use the opportunities you have to better train your force so that they're successful. But our primary effort was directed at destroying the Iraqis' ability to use its artillery on us, preparing the way for the 1st Infantry Division to open a huge breach to allow other 7th Corps divisions to flow off our right and left shoulder and continue the attack deeper into Iraq. Next slide. Here are the raid results. And without a doubt, the force artillery did their work in destroying much of the enemy's capability, as I describe in detail in the book. Almost nothing has been written about this anywhere. It was vitally important, at least I felt it was vitally important, to the Army of today to take note of what worked in the past, and in fact will be needed in the future again on future battlefields, namely overwhelming artillery firepower and massed fires to shock and destroy the enemy. Next slide, please. As a matter of interest, we fired a huge amount of ammunition during both the raids and the preparation. The difference from past wars was the intelligence we had in this one to accurately target the enemy to make the best use of our ammunition. In the raids, we fired 9,208 projectiles and 1,606 rockets. Now, each of those rockets had 644 DPICM, that's a dual purpose munition that can be used against personnel and lightly armored vehicles. 644 in each rocket. So that meant in the raids, we put 1,034,264 bomblets on top of the enemy. After that, we fired a 30-minute preparation the day we did our breach with an additional 6,136 rounds and 414 rockets prior to the division's breach. The destruction of the enemy, therefore, was complete. And in fact, that preparation was 30 minutes long, 6,000 rounds in 30 minutes, 400 rockets in 30 minutes. Next slide. On this slide, you'll see the results of the division and the DeVardy's efforts. General Tom Rames' quote at the top, just moments before the preparation was fired on February 24th, 30 years ago today, basically says it all. And red below is a snapshot of what we accomplished when combined arms and synchronized combat power was brought to bear on the enemy. This is a lesson that today's Army must sustain. Of note, fully 25% of the 155 rounds fired in the CENTCOM theater were fired by the Big Red 1 DeVardy's 3 direct support battalions. Next slide. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. You can note the POWs in the center. Interestingly, our DeVardy Tactical Operations Center wound up processing 400 plus POWs in the course of this operation. And I write about that in some detail. Next slide. So the ceasefire was called on the morning of the 28th of February, and our Assistant S3, Major Tom Conneran, and I were glad to shed our chemical protective gear on a knoll west of our new position in Kuwait, and no, that is not a helicopter growing out of the top of my head. Here I smoked a fine celebration cigar that my brother-in-law sent me from Richmond, Virginia. Fortunately, that logistical system worked very well. Next slide. We had many challenges during this war, but I will highlight just a few, and here they are. They range from escaping the port to logistics, ammunition and fuel availability, understanding which artillery units would eventually support the division artillery so that we could plan effectively for their employment, positioning of that artillery within the maneuver space. You take for granted that you're in a desert, lots of room, but there are also lots of maneuver units. And you have to coordinate that with these battalion commanders so that they're not surprised that a 155 battery has shown up in their backyard. And also the sheer size of the artillery force that Mike Dodson was tasked to orchestrate. Chief among those challenges was the control of the huge number of battalions, 17 of them, 17 artillery battalions. That was an unprecedented amount for a DIVARTY to orchestrate in modern combat. I would highlight logistics as a major challenge, but I have to say this, our chief logistician in the 1st Infantry Division, Colonel Bob Shadley, was superb. He did a great job with the materials that he had, and my hat's off to him. Thank you, sir. Lieutenant General Gus Pagonis, CENTCOM's logistician, actually did get a lot of supplies delivered to the peninsula. The problem was getting them out of the port and into the field so the experts like Bob Shadley could actually distribute them to the units who were screaming bloody murder for everything. Next slide, please. Here's some major lessons learned. The annual reforger, the return of forces to Germany, where the 1st Infantry Division had the mission to be prepared to go to Germany and fall in on pre-positioned equipment there and continue the fight against a potential Soviet invasion reforger. Those exercises were very, very helpful to the division in preparing us to get into the theater of operations, primarily because a lot of our troops who were in the 1st Infantry Division in 1990 had in fact gone through reforger and had that experience from loading trains to conducting operations to get ready to go on deployment. But we were unprepared to deal with the confusion in the port, and it was mass confusion. As I've noted, the logistics infrastructure was absent in the port, making resupply a daily headache. Command and control of a large artillery force is in fact very difficult. But Mike Dodson and his team did it remarkably well. This highlights, by the way, the essentiality of the DIVARTY commander to do this important task for the division. And Dodson, frankly speaking, was the best I ever saw. I hope we'll have some questions on that because I've got some opinions I'd like to share with you. Mobility of the artillery is essential. The good news is the Army today is addressing this. Fratricide is an ever-present threat, and unexploded ordnance is always a problem. We expected 5% unexploded ordnance. We experienced 23%. Artillery survivability positions are also important for your ammunition holding areas and other survivability positions, but there simply was not enough engineer assets to go around in order to dig those properly. Going home, we learned that you need, and you have to draw from the division on this, from within the division's resources. You need to have a port support activity, essentially a battalion of people who form a unit within the division to get the equipment home. But we did this very well, despite the fact we did it on a very short timeline. And the division gets big kudos because they provided great people to do this job. I know that because, next slide, Major General Rame appointed me to command. the PSA. And for that, I had the pleasure of remaining in Iraq for an additional several months. I was not a big fan with my family, but I got to tell you something. This PSA assignment was a real blessing to me. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about something I knew nothing about, which is loading a division into 13 or 14 ships. My transportation movement planner was Captain Renee Miller in the center, and she was superb. My senior NCO on the right was Sergeant First Class Doug Evans. He nicknamed Miller the Hammer because she was a real taskmaster when it came to loading ships. Everyone learned fast not to get in the way of the hammer, all 5 foot 5 inches of her. Next slide. So tactically, what lessons did we learn from the first Gulf War? Clearly, air-land battle doctrine developed by Vietnam veterans in the 1970s worked. That was the real testament to how they sought to improve the Army after the Vietnam War, and they did. The well-vetted logistics doctrine that we had in Europe and in Asia and in CONUS was not easily adaptable to a desert that essentially had no infrastructure. The war highlighted the need for the DIVARTY as well as the field artillery brigades to have a peacetime training relationship, as they may be, in fact, tasked to fight with each other or together in future battles. Joint operations among the services was also completely validated, particularly between the Army and the Air Force's close air support. Although there were some holes in that, all in all, it worked well. The Army was at a high point in 1990 in terms of training and readiness, and that showed up on the battlefield. But there were holes in deploying and redeploying, and I suspect much of that has been addressed in the last 3 decades. I sure hope so. Next slide. Now, turning to strategic lessons. President Bush's assembly of a 35-nation coalition was brilliant, simply brilliant. And he kept it together, even as Israel was tempted to become involved when attacked by Iraqi Scud missiles. He provided great flexibility to commanders on the ground to get the job done and to allow them to do sound planning and permissive rules of engagement and excellent operational security OPSEC. The US dominance in military power was also a huge message to the world. We must never lose that capability or posture, particularly in the eyes of our chief competitors, but also those who would engage in aggression that impacts our vital national interests. Next slide. Finally, I take a look at the geopolitical results and ask several questions. Did we advance the family of nations concept in the New World Order imagined and articulated by President Bush? Would we have fought in subsequent war in Iraq had we eliminated Saddam Hussein once and for all? Were we agile in adapting the coalition's emerging conditions to that which presented themselves for exploitation? I discuss all of this in my final chapter, but please don't read ahead. No cheating is allowed. The bottom line is I do think we missed an opportunity here, but that is an assessment each and every one of us has to decide based on the facts and our view of them. I report, you decide. Next slide, please. Now, finally, some comments about the key players in this book. First, many of us never thought this was a war we would fight, and it speaks loudly to war planners today that you must be ready for any contingency. Tom Raim was simply a superb division commander and was always thinking ahead. And I can give you some examples of that if you ask. For him, there truly was no mission too difficult. Mike Dodson was the most competent and professional soldier I ever served with. I doubt that we could have done this so successfully without him. Our S3, Colonel retired Ed Cardenas, a major at the time, was the most unflappable and focused soldier among us. We were dear friends to this day. And my driver, PFC Roger Lee McGarry, pictured in this picture with that cannon, was just a soldier through and through. He was always at my side to get things done, and for which I am eternally grateful. The direct support battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonel then Harry Emerson, John Gingrich, and Lanny Smith, were just simply excellent. All the battalion commanders of the 17 battalions were wonderful, but I want to mention them because they were just so spectacular and did a great job. The DIVARTY staff, our NCOs, our soldiers of the DIVARTY were the best I've served with. All of them lived up to the division's motto: no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first. And again, a shout out to Captains Merv Heimel, Rick Nichols, Larry Seafelt, and Phil Besser. They worked for me, they were superb. And I have the fondest memory of being with them in combat. They were wonderful. Next slide. Here's my paid advertisement for strong field artillery in the future of the Army. These are the red legs of the past. I invite you to absorb the message on this slide. Next. And here are the Desert Redlegs that did so much to actually write this book. Next slide. This is a quote from the book's introduction, and it should tell you what I think about the Big Red One. Even now, it's too hard for me to read to you, so you'll have to read it for yourself. Next, please. So thank you very much, and I reserve the balance of my time to the Speaker of the House.
Thank you so much. If you give me 1 second, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and get this Q&A up. I did get a couple of questions, one question in through the email, so I do want to pull that up, and I do want to acknowledge I did accidentally jump ahead on a slide there for a second. I apologize. My hand twitched. Humans, I can't help it. Sometimes my hand twitches. So I believe I got us back on track. So thank you, everybody, for providing me with a little bit of grace today, as I had a little bit of a hand twitch there. But let me go ahead and get that one question up I got today from the mail. Can you explain the relationship between DIVARTY and the individual artillery BDEs? My experience is only with the Marine Corps artillery, where typically one artillery BN supports an infantry regiment.
Well, I think what you're referring to is the direct support relationship that brigades have. Every brigade in 1990 had their own direct support battalion. The field artillery brigades, however, were not direct support units per se. They were additional artillery that we would assign missions to. And the 4 standard tactical missions that the artillery has are direct support, reinforcing, general support reinforcing, and general support. And those standard tactical missions are drilled into artillerymen. They set all the conditions for what we do and who is responsible to do what in the mission to support our maneuver brigades. And that is why the artillery exists. We exist to support the ground component. And it's very important that you have a DIVARTY commander who is gifted at this, because he's the right hand of the division commander. My personal belief is the division, and I'm getting ahead of the question a little bit, the division is still the fundamental echelon where we synchronize combat power. That's FM Scott Lingamfelter anyway. That's how I feel about it. And I think that it's very important that you have a DIVARTY and a fire support coordinator in the form of the DIVARTY commander to do that mission. And I can elaborate on that if people have questions on why that is important.
All right, and just as a reminder, everybody, to please, if you're going to be sending me questions, I can check them in the chat, but the quickest way is to get them to me in the question and answer button. But let's get over to that email. So this is a question about leadership. The direct support battalion commanders work for both the DIVARTY commander and for their supported brigade commander in a tactical sense. and the many battalions that came and went in a reinforcing general support, reinforcing role also had a dual of chain of commands. Can you offer any insights from your level as to challenges and successes from senior leadership perspective?
Well, I would say that as artillerymen, we are trained to have this relationship. We understood what our relationship was within the division artillery in terms of how we would be assigned a mission, whether it's direct support, reinforcing, general support, reinforcing, or support. At the same time, I never met a battalion commander in my time in the Army who didn't understand, a particularly direct support battalion commander, who didn't understand his primary purpose is to ensure that his brigade commander's scheme of maneuver is properly supported. That's why that direct support mission exists. You don't need to assign a battalion directly to the brigade. What you need is to ensure that the DS battalion commander understands what his role is in providing direct support. And all of them that I saw in action, John Gingrich and Harry Emerson and Lanny Smith, they knew that stuff cover to cover. They supported their brigade commanders rather well. And I suppose that if you were to ask Burt Maggart or Tony Marino or Dave Wiseman whether or not their direct support battalions did a good job, they would all tell you they did a great job. And they knew who to quote satisfy, which was that brigade commander. At the same time, those DS battalion commanders knew they also had a relationship with that DIVARTY commander as the senior fire support coordinator. So artillerymen are gifted. We can use both of our ears at the same time.
Were the coalition force friendly fire casualties in Desert Storm? And if so, what were the circumstances?
Well, I can speak primarily within the division, and of course we did have some friendly fire incidents. I think that if you read Greg Fontenot's very good account of Desert Storm and our role there, he gives really very good treatment to that. So I would encourage you to get his book. I did not spend as much time on that. I can tell you I did spend some time on some pretty bad near misses. And bad things happen in combat, particularly when you don't follow your training procedures. And we experienced some of that. One of the things that we experienced that we hadn't planned on was the dud rate in the DPICM. I mentioned in the briefing that we expected 5%. That's what all the operational testing told us we would see with the DPICM, in particular, the dual purpose munition. But it wound up being about 23%. Now, for an MLRS rocket that carries 644 DPICM, that means you've got, 495 that still work. That's still pretty lethal. You can ask the artillery, you can ask the Iraqis that, and they nicked the rain. So even when we had duds in our DPICM, it was still very, very lethal. Here's the problem. The things that didn't go off essentially became mini landmine fields for us. So we had to negotiate those. And there were some cases in the war where people drove across those things and blew off a tire or were seriously hurt or wounded. That's a very dangerous thing. So the Army's really got to make sure we have this dud rate thing right. The Air Force also contributed some of that as well with their submunitions that did not function properly. Of course, we had some sad cases where soldiers thought that you could actually pick these things up and keep them for souvenirs, and that was not very smart. Usually did not end very well for people who did that. So we were constantly advising people, don't step on these things, don't drive over these things.
Yeah.
You had to watch out.
Could you provide some examples of how Major General Rame planned ahead, and also Dodson? How did Dodson plan ahead?
Well, I wrote quite a bit about it in the book, so make sure you buy the book and read it. But I will tell you there are two instances about Tom Rame, who I have the deepest regard for. He and I live here in the same county, and I just have the deepest respect for that fellow. But there were two things that I can tell you that were very, very important that he did. Number one, in the summer of 1990, and I remember I was a Middle East FAO. I thought I knew the Middle East as well as anybody in the division. And I'm eternally grateful, by the way, that Tom Rame didn't move me to the intel shop, let me stay down with the Devari, because he did get wind that I was a Middle East FAO, but he told me he was never going to move me anyway. So in any case, Tom really, and Greg Fontenot talks about this in his book, really didn't believe that the division was necessarily a candidate to be tapped to go out to fight in Desert Storm. He thought that because of our traditional mission as backup for Europe and Reforger and so on and so forth, for which we were well trained, that there would be some hesitation of pulling us away from that mission. But I think that where he was wise was he said, but they could still call on us. And so he essentially, in the summer and in the fall, prior to our November alert of 1990, he had us lean forward in the foxhole. And we began to think things through and plan for things and check our kit bags and making sure we were ready to go, focusing on the kind of training, on the kind of warfighter exercises, the simulations that we would need to do in order to be prepared to execute this kind of mission. And lo and behold, we were tasked to do it. I think that he was very prescient in getting the division leaning forward. The second thing is when we got into Desert Storm, he worked the 7th Corps hard to get a follow-on mission. He knew, as many of us knew, that if we got through the breach, we would probably get through in pretty good shape, primarily because we had all this artillery that beat up the enemy. But you have to have a follow-on mission. One of the tenets of planning is what? Plan for success. And Tom really wanted us to have a follow-on mission. And at first, there was some hesitation by the 7th Corps to give us that follow-on mission. He just doggedly pursued it, as well as our G3, Terry Bullington, who earned his name, by the way, Bullington, because he pressed hard on the Corps staff to give us that follow-on mission. They eventually did, and lo and behold, when we got into the breach, up, jump straight away, and we needed that mission, and we needed to have thought through it, which we did, because we got called to jump further, 115 kilometers into Kuwait, and we were ready to go. So that was a very prescient thing. Tom Rame thought things through. That's why he was such a good commander.
Do you have any overall thoughts about the performance of the National Guard artillery units versus the regular Army?
Well, that's a very good question. We had the 142nd Field Artillery Brigade from Arkansas, Bill Clinton's own, that was sent out to support us. It was, I think I'm right about this, it was the sole National Guard unit that was fully activated for active duty for this war. And when they came out, they were quite a handful. They were very good shooters, but they lacked a little of the, shall we say, discipline that we saw in our active duty unit. So they were a bit of a challenge, but they shot very well and did very well. And I was very proud of them.
So this gentleman, he was in Bravo 1st to the 5th Field Artillery, and he was curious which unit was the logistical support for the 1st to the 5th Field Artillery Battalion.
I believe that would have been the 101st Forward Support Battalion. That would have been the traditional one to have done that. But if I've got that wrong, I'm sure that Greg Fontenot will zip off an email to me first thing in the morning. And
we'll find out tomorrow morning. Can you tell us a little bit more about how targets are acquired and assigned?
Great question. We were very blessed to have great intelligence. I had been assigned before years before I was in the 1st Infantry Division. I was a Middle East FAO in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and my portfolio in the current intelligence shop there was to monitor the Iran-Iraq war, which I did every day of my life for 3 years. So I knew how these guys would fight. So we had very good intelligence on how the Iraqis would array themselves on the battlefield. We also had satellite imagery, we had signals intelligence, we had electronic intelligence, and we were able to put together a composite picture of what we thought was on the ground. Interestingly, we didn't have any drones or UAVs at the time, but the British did. And the British actually flew those from that British unit that was with us actually flew out and was able to look at some of this stuff. So Ed Cardenas and our intel people, Sandy Artman and others, in our already talked, began to put together a picture of what we thought was on the ground when we were back in TAA Roosevelt. And it's kind of like the way a football coach, and this is the way I describe it in the book, prepares for a game. You template what you think the opposition is going to do, and then you build plays to deal with it. You build fire plans that you think you will need in order to take down that threat. And as we move forward into the forward battle area, our intelligence would improve. We would get additional signals intelligence, additional human intelligence, additional electronic intelligence, and we were able to refine that picture. And as we were able to, it produced a more accurate and better target picture for Ed Cardenas and his planners to plan the fires of the 17 battalions for the 8 days of raids. So intelligence was a real factor. It was very important. And we had a full intelligence in our Divardi talk that worked with our division assets and the division's intelligence battalion and put together a great program of fires. It worked.
With both the 8-inch and the 155 millimeters in use, what were the pros and cons of each? This was the last battle, the legacy of the 8-inch system, perhaps. Comment?
I have to have a friend out there that tees this question up. I need to find out who that was.
I'll report to you later.
Okay, great. I started off in an 8-inch battery with Dick Sherwood, Joe Monco, and Dean Phillips in the 2nd Battalion, and you could drop them in a rain barrel at 16 kilometers. I mean, they were just remarkably accurate cannons. But you're correct. This was the last big show of the 8-inch. I was also an XO of an 8-inch battalion, the first of the 76 that Colonel Ron Townsend commanded. And we were a long tube 8-inch. So these were long tube 8-inches in the 142nd FA Brigade. And they were very accurate. The 8-inch system was a very, very good system because it allowed you to range targets on the flanks of your position that you might not be able to range with your 155 direct support units, which were generally arrayed across the front with supported brigades. But the 8-inch was a great cannon system. The 155 is a wonderful cannon system. I don't know if people have seen the latest rendition of the 155 at Fort Riley. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's a great warfighting tool. And on top of that, it can actually keep up with the M1s and the Bradleys. We had a very difficult time, as those battalion commanders will tell you, with their 109 old systems keeping up with, which were legacy systems, trying to keep up with the M1 and the Bradley. That was a real challenge, and especially in that big jump that we did, that 115-kilometer jump. We were fortunate to have the 210th FRA Brigade forward that was supporting the unit that the 1st Division would pass through in that forward passage of lines that we did up at Objective Norfolk. Fortunately, they had DS battalions working for them that wound up supporting us, and we were able to use them in the initial roles to support the division while the rest of our units were catching up after this long road march. So lots of coordination, but we needed a faster platform. The Army has it now, so kudos to the Army for doing that.
Were our troops trained to function in the desert environment? Were there any problems relating to the hot and dry conditions?
We were actually well conditioned for the desert. The logistics was another matter, but I can tell you that as individual soldiers, many of us spent time at the National Training Center, which is at Fort Irwin, California, and that was a high desert environment, but in the summertime, that place was hot as blue blazes. I mean, so we had excellent desert orientation from our time at the National Training Center. The joke was, we were training in the desert in California to fight in the forest of Germany. Well, it turned out that fortunately we were training in the desert of California and wound up fighting in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. Kuwait.
I just want to remind everyone, we're getting a lot of questions, and so I will do my best to get to as many of these as possible. If I don't get to your question this evening and it is still on your mind, feel free to email it to me. Scott is very wonderful, and he's happy to take emails and get back to you, your questions in case we don't get to them this evening. Can you tell us about your observations at SOF, the signing of the peace agreement?
Oh, that was fascinating. I was, as I say, I was a Middle East FAA, and the DeVarty had a piece of setting that up as well. Mike Cuff, my dear friend Mike Cuff, who was working in the Division Fire Support Element, went up with Bill Carter, who was just a fantastic ADCM for our division. I'm just a great guy. I hope he's listening in tonight because he was dynamite. And Bill got the mission from Tom Rain to go set this thing up, the whole peacekeeping site. It was fascinating. I remember that the day of the signing, I went up to kind of make sure all my contribution to it was in good order. Mike Dotson sent me up to do that, but I have to tell you, I wish I had been a fly on the wall as a Middle East specialist inside of the tent where the negotiations were taking place. I witnessed everything from outside. I saw Norman Schwarzkopf come in, and I have a story about that in the book, about me and Schwarzkopf. You can read about that. I'm not going to give it away tonight, but I remember him coming in. I also remember Steve Payne, who was the aide-de-camp to Tom Rain, told me they took a break in the middle of the peace negotiations and came out and looked like there was going to be some kind of kerfuffle inside where the Iraqi generals were not being completely forthcoming with the location of some of our POWs. And so Schwarzkopf got up and walked out. And so that was a tense moment. But finally, they came to their sense and decided that they actually did know where the POW was, and the negotiations continued. So it was fascinating. Make no mistake about it. It was well orchestrated. We had all kinds of combat power surrounding this. So when these Iraqi generals came in, they came down this corridor of M1s and Bradleys and helicopters hovering over their vehicles as they came in. If they didn't think we had combat power, it was because they were dead and their senses didn't work. But it was a very well orchestrated effort to pull that together, and very successful. No incidents.
Could you tell us a little bit about how effective the radar units how effective were the radar units with adjusting fire?
The two radar systems we had, the Q-37 counter battery radar and the Q-36 counter mortar radar, were very reliable, very good radars. The problem was that 1950s technology, which means they had the telewave tubes that you saw on your mom and dad's television when you were kids. You know, they probably saw it in a junkyard. They look like just glass tubes. They're very fragile. So I suspect that the artillery has moved into a more solid state, better kind of radar. But the problem with our radars in the desert was it only took a little rough terrain to create a problem. But when they were operating, they were very accurate and very good. So as far as adjusting fire, we didn't use them a lot to adjust fire. We did use them to intercept indications when the Iraqis did fire. Again, our program of firing at them was so effective that we shut down a lot of counterfire. So we didn't have to deal with a lot of counterfire connection with the radar.
What were some of the challenges faced by towed artillery in keeping up with the tracked vehicles in a desert environment, and how were those challenges overcome?
Well, it certainly wasn't a challenge for the MLRS, because the MLRS, the multiple launch rocket system, was built on the Bradley fighting vehicle chassis with the engine system. So it could keep up with M1 Bradleys. It was the M109s that was the 1950s technology and the support vehicles for the 109s, which were, they just didn't have the power. They were underpowered. And so it was a little more of a challenge to keep up. And so the way you compensated for that is through positioning. You had to wisely position yourself so that you could get in, shoot, and then move forward, get in, shoot. In order that you would keep up, you would have to leapfrog your unit. In fact, I would tell you, Mike Dotson, I didn't answer the question, one of the prescient things that Mike did was he split our DeVarty TOC when we did that big jump that 115-kilometer jump, so that Ed Cortez would take half of it, I would take half of it, and we were able to leapfrog our command and control. Had we not done that, we'd have been out of the fight, because it's very difficult for wheeled vehicles to keep up with speed track vehicles. It's going to be a problem in the future. We will almost always be outrun by some of these fast moving vehicles. So you have to think in depth. You have to plan to stay in the fight. And Mike Dodson did a good job at that.
What was the effect on the enemy units during like the large bombardments? What did you find were the most effective weapons?
Well, shouldn't surprise you, the artillery. Right? The artillery, though, has been sort of the shock and awe weapon of the ground component for a very long time. I think it goes back quite a ways. In fact, I think Greg Fontenot is actually doing some research on this. I hope I don't give him away. He'll fuss at me later on it. But it's very, very important to have an artillery component that can bring mass and accurate fires on the enemy and devastate them. And there's no question we did that to the Iraqis. I mean, the Iraqis were the ones who gave the MLRS the nickname Steel Rain, because it was deadly. It was horrible. I felt bad for those guys. Honestly, I did. I mean, it's devastating. I mean, nothing could survive that stuff. Plus, we went to the Air Force and we had them drop B-52 bombs on these guys. It was not a good day to be an Iraqi soldier opposite the 1st Infantry Division 30 years ago. It just wasn't a good idea. So certainly the artillery had a major impact. As far as the direct fire systems, you can talk to maneuver guys, but I got to tell you something, nobody could defeat that M1. Nobody could defeat that badly. Those were excellent platforms, and they were very decisive up at Objective Norfolk when the division did its forward passage of lines at night in contact and passed second ACR to continue that fight. And that was largely a direct fire fight. In fact, the artillery contribution at Objective Norfolk in many cases was illumination rounds, so that the maneuver guys could get a better feel for what was going on. You don't want to drop a lot of cold steel on top of your maneuver guys at night when they're all mixed in trying to fight these Iraqis. But the ground guys did a great job with that, and their systems were totally validated.
I want to let you know our friend Greg Fontenot did chime in, and you are correct. The 101st Forward Support Battalion did support the 1st to the 5th.
I can't tell you how comforting it is to know.
Thank you, Greg. This is a really interesting question. I'm excited to hear what you have to say. How much of the mission determines the firepower and mobility needs an artillery unit, and how much of it is reactionary?
Well, it's both, and it's going to always be both. You certainly plan fires to support the scheme of maneuver of your brigade and your battalion commanders who are looking to do the actual ground maneuver. So you've got that planning component. That never goes away. Target sets get planned, target groups get planned, smoke missions get planned, all kinds of things. The things that are consistent with your scheme of maneuver. The things that are reactive, things like counterfire. When the bad guys shoot at you, it's detected by the artillery and you shoot back. Or you get good intelligence. Now we have drones, all kinds of interesting AI systems that are flying around the battlefield giving target information back. So of it will be pre-planned based on what we know from an intelligence viewpoint. Some of it will be essentially still reactive, but planned in expectation to support a particular scheme of maneuver, like an envelopment or a deliberate assault of some sort, where the artillery is given specific missions to fire to clear an area so that the maneuver can exploit the situation after enemy units have been destroyed. So some of it's planning, some of it's reactive. What's the ratio? I'm not sure what the ratio is, but I can tell you that in my time as a field artilleryman, I tried to do as much planning in support of the maneuver guys I possibly could in anticipation of the situation requiring fires. But you have to be ready. You have to be ready to react.
I know we have a lot of young historians who like to join us on these presentations, so this is a great question for them too. Can you please talk to us a little bit about survey and then brand new technology at the time, the GPS?
Well, this is like the 8-inch for me. I was a survey officer also. I was a survey trained officer, so I knew how to do manual survey. I'm very disappointed that that's gone by the wayside. I think now we're totally dependent on GPS and other kinds of smart intelligence. And my only criticism of that is as soon as the satellites go out, what are you going to do? Do you still know how to do simultaneous observation? Do you still know how to pick up survey from a survey point and then carry it forward, traverse it forward, and establish it somewhere? A lot of manual survey has gone by the wayside, and I think that that is a mistake, and I hope that it comes back. But yes, we do, I think now, rely on a lot of GPS and high-tech satellite arrays to tell us where we are, to tell a camera to point, and so on and so forth. But I think that we need redundant systems. And I know I sound like an old broken bottle of beer, but that's how I feel about it. And that's my story, and I'm not changing.
All right. Just so everybody knows, we are going to honor our end time this evening. We have a hard end time around 8:10, 8:15-ish. So we are going to honor that. So I will get to a few more questions. I know I have a lot more here in the queue. If you had a thunder run moment, during what phase was
it? The question is, what wasn't it? I mean, there was always some excitement going on. I think that the phase that was probably the most predictive is when we were in TAA Roosevelt, because we weren't forward yet. We weren't actually engaging the enemy. When we got up into the ridge, that was thunder run every day. There was always something going on. But I suppose the most exciting piece was in fact that leap forward to Objective Norfolk. I remember being in the convoy. I was at the back, Ed Cardenas was at the front. It got very dark. All of a sudden we started seeing tanks on fire to our left, to our right. And I called him and I said, Ed, are we leading this assault to Objective Norfolk, or are we supporting the rest of the division? He said, no, we're supporting the rest of the division. And as soon as he said that, our Bradleys and tanks went shooting past us on either side of our convoy. I thought, this is a dangerous place that's not on the battlefield. So that was a wake-up moment for me, I suppose.
With the volume of fire, did you actually wear out some tubes?
I actually do what?
Wear out some tubes.
I can't answer that. I don't think so, because what we did is we made sure that the tube life on our howitzers going out were essentially brand new. So there were some things that we did to ensure that they were in good shape. But as I recall, we didn't change out any tubes. Now, as soon as I say that, John or Harry or Lanny are going to say, no, I changed 5 of these things. And that's fine. If they do, then I'll have to write that in my next book.
Can you share some insight about the health of the Big Red One as a result of the Gulf War?
The what of the Big Red One?
About the health. How was it after the Gulf War?
Well, I think it came out pretty well. When we went into the port to ship the equipment back, it was in remarkably good shape. The 6,000 vehicles that I shipped back to the division with the 500 or so guys who were working for me in the PSA, I have very little memory of having to drag our equipment onto the ships. In other words, everything started up and rolled on. And so when we got back, I'm sure we had a lot of work to do, changing out track and changing tires. And I mean, the desert is brutal on tires. Our helicopters, now that was interesting because they took a lot of wear and tear in their turbine engines because of the particles, the fine particles of sand. And there were some major rebuilds that we had to do there. And that's one of the reasons that I put a priority on shipping the helicopters back as quickly as I could to Fort Riley. But I think it came back in good shape. They were certainly well trained, they were certainly well disciplined, and they were combat veterans now. So they knew what they needed to do in future wars.
We have a friend here, Eduardo. He says, Scott, you're right. I don't remember having to change out any tubes.
Well, I'll just say right now to my dear friend and brother, Ed Cardenas, Ed, you're right. We didn't change out any tubes.
All right. What new equipment did Davari get in preparation for deployment to Saudi Arabia?
New 5-ton trucks, lots of, we got the GPS, which weren't Army GPSs. Terry Bullington actually went out to some hunting shop somewhere in Kansas and bought the things on a credit card. And they were pretty cool. But curiously, Mike Dodson and our S4, we sent our S4 out to get fully gimbaled marine compasses like on a boat, and we attached them to the dashboards of our Humvees. So to a certain extent, each of our Humvees became like navigating a ship. And so we used dead reckoning and our maps and our odometers and speedometers to do a lot of that. Artillerymen love to do that stuff anyway. So, but we did get new 5-ton trucks. We had all of our MLRSs were rebuilt by the Redstone Arsenal. They came up from Texas and rebuilt every one of them. And that was great because the operational readiness rate of those rocket launchers was quite good throughout the entire war. Rick Nichols did a great job with Bravo 6, and he kept his stuff running. We had very few cases where his rocket launchers were not ready to go.
Greg from the 5th Field Artillery also says that they didn't change out any. He did not change out any tubes either.
I would like to tell Greg he's also very right.
Can you tell us a little bit about the choice to eliminate the 113 armed personnel carrier to a Bradley platform?
I really can't give you a lot of information about that. I can tell you, as Mike Dodson and I used to talk frequently about the inadequacy of the 113 chassis used for the M577 command tracks that we have our fire direction centers in. That they worked fairly well, but they just couldn't keep up. And the artillery has really got to figure this out. I don't think that we have yet, but we need a better, more mobile, quicker, more deployable system for our command and control. And Davari used these Expendo vans, which were unbelievably slow. But fortunately, we were able to get away with doing that fairly well.
Excellent. We have time for one more, and it's more of a comment. And I do know they have a couple questions in the queue I did not get to this evening. I apologize. If they're still pressing on your brain, please email it to me. Happy to send them over to Scott, and he'll answer them separately. But this is a comment, and I think it's a good place to end. It's from our friend Greg Fontenot, who's on the presentation this evening. Hi, Greg. He has an observation. I'd like to hear your response to this. The only system the Army had that worked right at the start of World War II was the U.S. Field Artillery. We had the best artillery during World War II and through Desert Storm. Thoughts?
Well, I guess I owe Fontenot a beer. I guess that's what I have to say back. But I will say this. I want to thank Greg in particular. He wrote a great book, and I read that book. And that helped me do a lot of good things to get the timelines in this book aligned properly. I did keep a diary. Mike Dodson had a journal, so I'm very confident about what I wrote in this book. But it was very, very helpful to me in order to get the backstory on some things. You know, here's the comment I'd make. The artillerymen have their view of this war. Greg Fontenot and the maneuver guys have their view of this war. No view is completely correct, which is why we have to write, which is why we have to have more young soldiers keeping journals, officers keeping journals, and writing their perspective, because taken together, we'll get an accurate picture that will help the current leadership plot the right way forward for our Army, which it needs desperately. We've got to learn from the past. Desert Storm is a ripe opportunity for the Army to learn now what it must do for combat in the future as it returns itself to focus on what is considered large-scale warfare, which is what we used to call conventional warfare. Anyway, so there you go. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you forward to me. I'll do my best to get through those over the weekend and get back to folks.
Let me know if your question's still answered. I do want to take this moment, these last few minutes that we have with you, to remind everybody where they can get the book. Do you want to tell them a little bit about where they can purchase a signed copy?
Well, you can get a signed copy if you go here, right there. Can you see that?
Yes, and I'm going to drop it also in the chat section for all of you, everybody. That is www.copybookwarrior.com. I'm dropping it in the chat for you right now as well. And this is where you can get yourself a signed copy of the book.
Greatest website in the world. You go there, if you order it directly from me, and I've probably got several copies here, I can order more. I'll sign it, put it in the mail to you. You can buy it through my website there. It's a little more expensive because I have to mail it to you. Otherwise, you can go to Amazon. You can go to University Press of Kentucky. I would ask you to use them if you can, because that helps them, and they're my publisher, and I want to keep my publisher happy. But University Press of Kentucky, Desert Redleg, and you can find how to order the book there. Amazon, Books A Million, all the typical outlet places, Goodreads. You can go to all those places and get a copy of the book. Please get a copy of it, and make sure you give it, when you're done with it, that you give it to a young field artilleryman, so he understands, or she understands what needs to be done for the future.
And just so everybody knows, if you're planning on coming over to Cantini Park and you have reserved tickets for the First Division Museum, the tickets are free, but make sure you have reserved tickets right now to enter the First Division Museum. The book is also for sale at our Cantini Park gift shops. And so you can shop online, or if you're going to be in the area, you can stop there. All right, I'm going to throw it back over to Kowalski.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott, Laura, great job. And I was on the edge of my seat all evening. A lot of, things, just resonated with me. I'm an air defense artilleryman born out of the field artillery. And I was Bronco 1-6 for 2 years at the NTC. So memory. So thank you, Scott. And when this pandemic is over, we want you to come to Cantini and do this again in person.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, so much. We'll see you on Thursday, March 18th. If you've already registered for the next Date with History, please mind that the date did change. It is now on Thursday, March 18th. If you need a new link sent to you, always reach out to me. I'm always happy to help. So we will see you on Thursday, March 18th to learn a little more about the Battle of Batu.
Duty first.
Duty first. Have a great evening, everybody. Oh, and also want to say special thanks to all of our Desert Storm veterans, Desert Shield, Desert Storm veterans who did sign in tonight. We see you. Thank you so much for your service, especially during this anniversary year. And of course, thank you to all of our veterans who always attend. We love having you.